It started small, almost unnoticeable. Jenna had lived in her quiet suburban home for years, appreciating the peacefulness that came with her little cul-de-sac. The only disturbance, if you could call it that, was her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who lived alone in the house next door. Mrs. Thompson rarely left her house and kept to herself. The lights in her home were always dim, and her presence was often signaled by the creak of her front door or the occasional glimpse of her shuffling across her porch. One evening, as Jenna sat in her living room sipping tea, she noticed something strange. The light in Mrs. Thompson's upstairs bedroom flickered, a dull, irregular glow. It wasn't the kind of flicker that comes from a faulty bulb. It had a rhythm, almost as if someone was deliberately turning the light on and off. Jenna shrugged it off, assuming it was a power issue, but the flickering continued the next night, then the night after that. By the fourth night, Jenna couldn't ignore it. She found herself staring out her window at the neighbor's house, transfixed by the strange glow. Her mind wandered to a dark place. Was Mrs. Thompson okay? Could someone have broken in? But nothing else seemed out of place. The old woman's house was as still as ever. A week passed and the light flickered every night, always at the same time, always in that same unsettling pattern. Jenna's unease grew. On the 8th night, she decided to take action. She knocked on Mrs. Thompson's door but received no answer. She knocked again, harder, but still, there was silence. Concerned, she called out, "Mrs. Thompson, are you okay?" No response. As she turned to leave, she caught movement from the corner of her eye. The curtains in the upstairs window, the room with the flickering light, shifted. Someone was watching her. Her skin prickled with a deep sense of wrongness. Why? Mrs. Thompson wasn't the type to spy on her neighbors, and yet someone had been standing there watching her every move. That night, Jenna couldn't sleep. Every sound in her house felt amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the wind against the windows. But it was the light next door that kept her awake. It flickered endlessly, almost in sync with her heartbeat. She thought about calling the police but didn't want to seem paranoid. After all, Mrs. Thompson was an old woman. Maybe she just didn't want to be disturbed. The following morning, Jenna saw an ambulance pull up next door. Mrs. Thompson had died in her sleep. She'd been dead for days. The paramedics said she'd passed quietly, her body found in her downstairs bedroom. That didn't make sense to Jenna. What about the light upstairs? That night, the house next door was dark, empty. Jenna felt a weight lift off her shoulders, relieved that the mystery had come to an end. But as she got ready for bed, she glanced out the window. Her blood ran cold. The light was flickering again. When David moved into his new apartment, he was excited about the fresh start. The building was quiet, the neighbors kept to themselves, and the rent was reasonable. Everything seemed perfect. His unit was on the top floor of a 4-story building, and the only downside was the thin walls. Sometimes he could hear the person in the apartment next to his, a man named Carl, going about his daily routine. It wasn't too bad at first, just muffled conversations, the occasional sound of the TV, or footsteps late at night. But after a few months, something changed. David began hearing strange noises. Late at night, when everything else was quiet, he'd hear what sounded like whispering coming from Carl's apartment. It wasn't clear enough to make out the words, but the tone was unsettling, hushed, frantic, almost like an argument. David assumed Carl was talking on the phone and thought nothing more of it. One night, as David lay in bed reading, he heard something that made him freeze. It wasn't just whispering this time. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. He listened intently, his heart pounding in his chest, but the sound stopped abruptly. The next day, he ran into Carl in the hallway. "Everything okay in there?" David asked, trying to sound casual. Carl just smiled, his eyes darting away quickly. "Yeah, just moving some furniture around," he muttered, brushing past David. Something about Carl's behavior put David on edge, but he didn't push the matter. The noises continued over the next few weeks, growing more frequent and disturbing. There were nights when David would hear loud crashes, followed by long stretches of silence. Other times, he'd hear what sounded like sobbing, muffled and distant. And then there were the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to circle Carl's apartment late into the night. David decided to confront Carl, but every time he knocked on his door, there was no answer. It was as if Carl had vanished. Yet the noises persisted, growing more intense with each passing night. David could barely sleep, his nerves frayed by the constant disturbances. One evening, desperate for answers, David went to the building manager. "I've been hearing strange noises from my neighbor's apartment," he explained, "but I haven't seen Carl in days. Can you check on him?" The manager gave him a puzzled look. "Carl? No one's lived in that apartment for months. The last tenant moved out after his wife passed away." David's stomach twisted in knots. "That's not possible," he insisted. "I've talked to him. I've heard him." The manager shook his head. "That apartment's been empty. You're the only one on this floor." That night, David couldn't bear to stay in his apartment. The whispering, the dragging sounds, the footsteps, they were louder than ever, echoing through the walls. As he packed a bag to leave, he glanced out his window and saw a shadowy figure standing in Carl's apartment, watching him from the dark. Sarah had always felt safe in her quiet suburban neighborhood. Her backyard, surrounded by a tall wooden fence, was her sanctuary. But one evening, as she sat on the porch, she noticed something strange. A figure standing just beyond the fence. Tall and still, the figure seemed to be watching her from the shadows. She blinked and he was gone. Unease crept over her, but she convinced herself it was nothing. Maybe just a neighbor passing by. The following evening, Sarah found herself glancing nervously at the spot where the figure had been. For a while, there was nothing. But as the light faded, she saw him again. Closer this time, standing just beyond the fence, staring. Her heart pounded as she quickly went inside, locking the door behind her. She told her husband Tom about the man, but he brushed it off, saying it was probably just a prank. Sarah wanted to believe him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few nights later, Sarah was lying in bed when she heard a faint noise coming from the backyard, a slow, rhythmic creaking. Her stomach dropped. It was the gate. She nudged Tom awake, whispering, "Someone's in the backyard." Tom groggily got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. He opened the back door, but when he shone the light into the yard, it was empty. The gate was slightly open, swaying in the breeze. "You probably forgot to latch it," Tom said. But Sarah knew she hadn't. For the next few days, Sarah avoided the backyard. Even inside, she felt like she was being watched. The unease gnawed at her, and each night the fear grew. She'd hear faint footsteps outside, the gate creaking, but every time she looked, the yard was empty. One evening, Sarah was home alone when she heard a soft thud outside. Her heart pounded as she approached the window and peeked through the blinds. Her blood ran cold. The man was in the yard, inside the fence this time. He stood in the corner, just beyond the reach of the porch light, watching. She backed away from the window, her hands shaking, and called Tom. "He's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The man, he's in the backyard." Tom rushed home, but by the time he arrived, the man was gone. They checked the yard, but there was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no evidence. Tom was skeptical, but Sarah knew what she had seen. The next morning, Sarah found a single muddy footprint near the back door. The man hadn't just been watching her from the alley, he was getting closer. From that night on, Sarah never felt safe in her home again. Every creak, every gust of wind felt like a warning. The man might be gone, but she knew he could return. Waiting, watching.
Thanks for watching the video. We hope you enjoyed the journey. If you loved the twists and turns, don't forget to hit the like button and share the stories with your friends. Make sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss out on our next thrilling tale, because there's always a new mystery or adventure just around the corner. Until next time, keep imagining, keep exploring, and remember, nothing is ever quite what it seems.